June 12, 2024, the day Venezuela called America's bluff. Let me tell you about the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. It wasn't the headlines, those came later, after the fact, when the story had already been neatly packaged for public consumption. No, it was the silence first. The way naval analysts I've known for 20 years went quiet on secure channels. The way satellite tracking forums, usually buzzing with real-time updates, suddenly had gaps in their data. And then, Venezuela, a country under crushing U.S. sanctions, had just taken delivery of a Russian Kilo-class submarine, not just any sub, but one of the most advanced diesel-electric attack vessels in the world, capable of lurking undetected in the Caribbean for weeks at a time. At first glance, this might seem like just another piece of Cold War nostalgia, a rogue state getting a hand-me-down from Moscow. But that's exactly what they want you to think. Because if you believe that, you'll miss the real. This isn't about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American naval dominance in its own backyard. It's about the quiet, methodical construction of a multipolar world where the U.S. no longer gets to dictate the rules. And most importantly, it's about the fact that Washington's response to this challenge will determine whether the next decade is defined by escalation or restraint. I've spent my career studying how great powers stumble into crises they never saw coming. And let me be, this is one of those moments. The question isn't whether this submarine deployment is significant, it is. The question is whether anyone in Washington is prepared to admit just how much it changes the game. The official, a routine transfer? Here's the story the media is running with, the one you'll hear from State Department briefings and think tank talking. Venezuela, facing economic collapse and international isolation, has turned to Russia for military support. The Kilo-class submarine, specifically, the Petrograd, a Project 636.3 variant, was delivered as part of a long-standing arms deal, one that Moscow has framed as purely defensive. The Russian government insists this is business as usual, a sovereign nation exercising its right to self-defense. The U.S. response? A mix of diplomatic protest and sanctions, more of the same, really. The Pentagon has downplayed the threat, noting that the submarine is old, that Venezuela lacks the infrastructure to maintain it, and that the U.S. Navy could sink it in a heartbeat. The numbers seem to support the official line. The Kilo-class is a 1980s design, after all. Venezuela's Navy is a shadow of what it was in the 1970s. And let's not, the U.S. has dozens of nuclear-powered attack submarines patrolling the Atlantic at any given time. What's one more diesel boat in the mix? But here's the problem with this: it ignores the context. And in geopolitics, context is everything. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the submarine itself. Yes, the Kilo-class first entered service in the 1980s, but the Petrograd isn't some rusting relic. It's a Project 636.3, the latest export variant, equipped with advanced sonar, anti-ship missiles, and the ability to fire caliber cruise missiles. These are the same missiles Russia used to devastating effect in Syria. And while Venezuela might not have the most sophisticated navy in the world, they've been quietly modernizing their submarine force for years. In 2019, they sent crews to Russia for training. In 2021, they refurbished their naval base at Puerto Cabello to accommodate larger vessels. And in 2023, they conducted joint exercises with the Russian Navy in the Caribbean, exercises that, notably, included submarine operations. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Petrograd didn't just show up in Venezuelan waters one day. Satellite imagery from late May shows it transiting the Atlantic under escort, not from Russia, but from Cuba. That's Cuba, a country that hasn't had a submarine since the 1990s, suddenly had a Russian Kilo-class boat docked at its port for nearly a week before it made the final leg of its journey. Why? Because Cuba has the infrastructure to support it. Because Venezuela's ports are under constant U.S. surveillance. And because this wasn't just a delivery, it was a demonstration. But the real kicker? The U.S. knew this was coming. Intelligence reports from early 2024 indicated that Russia was preparing to transfer at least one Kilo-class submarine to Venezuela as part of a broader effort to extend its military footprint in the Western Hemisphere. The Biden administration chose not to intercept it. Why? Because doing so would have risked a direct confrontation with Russia, one that could have escalated into something far worse. Instead, they let it happen, then downplayed its significance. That's not incompetence. That's strategic restraint. And it tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Washington is taking this. The broader geopolitical why this matters. To understand why this submarine is such a big deal, you have to out. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as if the Western Hemisphere is its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a historical footnote, it's the unspoken foundation of American foreign policy. And for most of that time, no one dared challenge it. Russia had its hands full in Eastern Europe. China was focused on the Pacific. And Latin America, for all its turbulence, was firmly within Washington's orbit. That's no longer true. What we're seeing now is the culmination of a decade-long push by Russia and China to erode American dominance in what the US still considers its backyard. It started with small Russian bombers flying near Alaska, Chinese warships conducting friendly port calls in Argentina. Then came the bigger Nicaragua granting Russia access to its ports, Cuba hosting Russian nuclear-capable bombers, and now, Venezuela acquiring a submarine that can threaten US shipping lanes. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about signaling. Russia and China are sending the US can't dictate who operates in the Western Hemisphere anymore. And they're doing it in a way that's just ambiguous enough to avoid a direct confrontation. After all, Venezuela is a sovereign nation. It does have the right to buy weapons from Russia. And if the US tries to stop it, it risks looking like the bully, especially when it's already arming Ukraine and Taiwan to the teeth. This is classic gray zone actions that fall below the threshold of war but still shift the balance of power. And the US is struggling to respond because its entire strategy is built on the assumption that no one would dare challenge it in its own neighborhood. Military, the silent threat beneath the waves. Now, let's talk about what this submarine actually means for US security. The Kilo class is often called the black hole because of its ability to evade detection. It's quiet, it's lethal, and it's designed to operate in shallow waters, exactly the kind of environment you find in the Caribbean. For the US Navy, this is a nightmare scenario. The Atlantic Fleet is optimized for blue water operations, hunting Russian and Chinese submarines in the deep ocean. But the Caribbean? That's a different game. The US has some anti-submarine warfare capabilities in the region, but they're spread thin. And Venezuela isn't just getting one submarine. Intelligence suggests they're in talks to acquire 2 more. Here's the thing about they're the ultimate asymmetric weapon. A single Kilo-class boat can't win a war against the US Navy. But it can complicate things. It can force the US to divert resources, to scramble ASW assets, to keep a constant watch on shipping lanes. And in a crisis, say, if the US ever decided to enforce a naval blockade on Venezuela, that submarine becomes a major liability. But the real danger isn't what Venezuela can do with this submarine. It's what Russia can do with it. Because let's be the Petrograd isn't just a Venezuelan asset. It's a Russian forward operating base. Moscow has a long history of using proxy states to project power. In Syria, they used the Tartus naval base to support their operations in the Mediterranean. In Venezuela, they now have a submarine that can operate under the Venezuelan flag but with Russian crews and Russian intelligence support. This is how great powers fight without fighting. And the US is woefully unprepared for it. The domestic political why no one in Washington wants to talk about this. Here's the part that fascinates me: the silence from Washington. You'd think a Russian submarine showing up in Venezuela would be front-page news. You'd think there would be hearings, think tank L's, urgent briefings on Capitol Hill. But there hasn't been. Why? Because no one in power wants to admit how bad this looks. For the Biden administration, this is a lose-lose scenario. If they overreact, they risk escalating tensions with Russia at a time when the US is already stretched thin supporting Ukraine. If they underreact, they look weak, especially to a Republican base that's already convinced Biden is soft on foreign policy. So they've done what administrations always do in these: they've downplayed it. But the real reason for the silence is deeper. The US foreign policy establishment is still operating under the assumption that the post-Cold War order is permanent. They can't fathom that a country like Venezuela would dare to challenge American dominance. They can't accept that Russia and China are playing a long game, one that doesn't involve direct confrontation but instead chips away at US influence piece by piece. And here's the American public doesn't even know this is happening. Because the media, by and large, has bought into the official narrative. A Russian submarine in Venezuela? That's just another day in the news cycle. No one's connecting the dots. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the status quo holds. In this scenario, the Petrograd becomes just another part of Venezuela's military, conducting occasional patrols but never posing a serious threat. The US increases surveillance in the region, maybe imposes a few more sanctions, but otherwise doesn't escalate. Russia gets to keep its foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and China continues its economic inroads in Latin America. The US pretends this isn't a big deal, even as its dominance in the region slowly erodes. This is the most likely outcome, not because it's the best, but because it's the least bad. No one wants a crisis, so everyone plays it safe. Scenario 2, escalation by proxy. Here's where things get messy. Venezuela, emboldened by its new submarine, starts harassing US shipping or conducting provocative patrols near US territorial waters. The US responds with more sanctions, maybe even a limited naval blockade. Russia then increases its military support to Venezuela, perhaps sending more submarines or even deploying its own naval forces to the region. The US and Russia end up in a standoff, not unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this time, with no clear off-ramp. This scenario is dangerous because it's plausible. Venezuela has a history of provocation. The US has a history of overreaction. And Russia? They'd love nothing more than to force the US to choose between backing down or risking a direct conflict. Scenario 3, the unthinkable. This is the scenario no one wants to talk about, but we'd be fools to ignore it. In this version of events, the US decides it can't tolerate a Russian submarine operating in its backyard. Maybe there's an incident, a near miss between a US destroyer and the Petrograd. Maybe Venezuela sinks a ship. Whatever the trigger, the US responds with force. It sinks the submarine. Russia retaliates, perhaps by striking a US base in the region. And suddenly, we're in a shooting war with a nuclear power. This is the least likely scenario, but it's not impossible. And the scariest part? The US has no good options if it comes to that. Grand strategy: the end of American primacy? Let's take a step back and ask the bigger why is this happening? The answer is the US is trying to maintain a level of global dominance that is no longer sustainable. For 30 years, America has acted as if it could dictate the rules of the international system without consequence. It invaded Iraq. It exited NATO to Russia's borders. It waged economic warfare against countries that refused to play by its rules. And for a while, it worked. No one dared challenge the US because the cost of defiance was too high. But that era is over. Russia and China have spent the last decade building alternatives to the US-led order. They've created their own financial systems, their own military alliances, their own spheres of influence. And now, they're pushing back not by directly confronting the US, but by eroding its dominance in places where it least expects it. Venezuela is just one example. There's also Nicaragua, where Russia is building a new military base. There's Cuba, where China is investing billions in infrastructure. And there's the whole of Latin America, where US influence is at its lowest point in decades. This isn't about ideology. It's about power. Russia and China don't care if Venezuela is socialist or capitalist. They care that it's a weak point in the US sphere of influence. And they're exploiting it. The tragedy is that the US could have prevented this. It could have engaged with Latin America as a partner, not as a hegemon. It could have recognized that other countries have their own interests, their own security concerns. But instead, it doubled down on coercion. And now, it's reaping the consequences. What should the US do instead? So what's the alternative? How does the US respond to this challenge without making things worse? First, it needs to accept that the world is changing. The era of unipolarity is over. The US can't dictate the rules anymore. It has to negotiate them. Second, it needs to engage with Latin America not as a patron, but as a partner. That means respecting sovereignty, even when it's inconvenient. It means offering real economic alternatives, not just sanctions and threats. Third, it needs to deter without provoking. The US should make it clear that any direct Russian or Chinese military action in the Western Hemisphere will be met with a severe response. But it should also avoid unnecessary escalation. That means no blockades, no preemptive strikes, no regime change operations. Finally, the US needs to compete where it matters. If China is investing in Latin American infrastructure, the US should be doing the same. If Russia is selling submarines, the US should be offering better deals. This isn't about military power, it's about influence. This is controversial, I know. The hawks in Washington will call it appeasement. The ideologues will say it's surrender. But the reality is that the US can't maintain its dominance through force alone. It has to earn it. The bottom A wake-up call. Let me leave you with the Petrograd isn't just a submarine. It's a symbol. A symbol of a world where the US is no longer the sole superpower. A world where other countries have options. A world where American dominance is no longer guaranteed. The question: what is the US going to do about it? Will it double down on coercion, risking more crises like this one? Or will it adapt, accepting that the world has changed and that its strategy needs to change with it? I've been studying geopolitics for decades. I've seen empires rise and fall. And I can tell you the most dangerous moment for any great power is when it refuses to accept that its time at the top is coming to an end. The Petrograd is a wake-up call. The question is whether anyone in Washington is listening. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the entire architecture of US power in the Western Hemisphere and how quickly that architecture is crumbling. The Petrograd isn't just a submarine, it's a test case. A test of whether the US can still enforce its Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century, or whether we're watching the doctrine's slow-motion collapse. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will militarily, economically, politically. The list is Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, AMA in 1989, Haiti in 1994, and again in 2004. Even the failed coup in Venezuela in 2002 was, by all accounts, at least tacitly supported by Washington. The message was cross the US, and you'll pay a price. But here's the uncomfortable: that price is no longer as steep as it used to be. Russia and China have spent the last decade systematically eroding US dominance in the region, not through invasion or regime change, but through the quiet, relentless accumulation of leverage. And the Petrograd is just the latest and most audacious example. Take the numbers. In 2000, China's trade with Latin America was a mere $12 billion. By 2023, it had ballooned to over $450 billion, nearly double the US trade volume with the region. China is now the top trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. It's the second largest for Argentina and Colombia. And it's not just trade. Since 2005, China has loaned over $138 billion to Latin American governments, more than the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the U.S. Export-Import Bank combined. Most of those loans are tied to infrastructure: ports in Peru, railways in Argentina, a space station in Patagonia. And crucially, they come with no strings attached, no demands for democratic reforms, no human rights conditions, no lectures about corruption. Russia's approach is different but equally effective. While China buys influence with cash, Russia does it with arms. Since 2010, Moscow has sold over $14 billion in military equipment to Latin America, including fighter jets to Nicaragua, helicopters to Peru, and air defense systems to Venezuela. The Petrograd deal is just the latest in a long line of Russian military exports to the region, but it's the first to directly challenge U.S. naval supremacy. And that's no accident. Here's the US Navy has spent the last 30 years assuming it would always have unchallenged control of the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. That assumption underpins everything from the AMA Canal's security to the US Southern Command's posture in Florida. But a Russian submarine operating in Venezuelan waters changes the calculus. It doesn't just threaten US ships, it forces the Navy to rethink its entire operational planning. Suddenly, the Caribbean isn't a safe zone anymore. It's a contested space. And that's the real geopolitical earthquake here. The US has spent trillions of dollars and decades of effort building a global military that can project power anywhere, anytime. But what happens when that power is no longer unchallenged in its own neighborhood? What happens when a country like Venezuela, sanctioned, isolated, economically crippled, can still punch above its weight by hosting a foreign submarine? Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, the US nearly went to war with the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Kennedy administration imposed a naval blockade, threatened invasion, and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Why? Because the idea of Soviet military assets in the Western Hemisphere was an existential threat to US security. Fast forward to 2024, and Russia has not only deployed a submarine to Venezuela but done so with barely a peep from Washington. The difference isn't just in the hardware, it's in the power dynamics. In 1962, the US was at the height of its post-World War II dominance. Today, it's a superpower in relative decline, stretched thin by wars in the Middle East, tensions with China, and a domestic political crisis. Now, some in Washington will argue that this is just a blip, a desperate move by a failing regime. They'll point to Venezuela's economic collapse, its hyperinflation, its mass exodus of citizens. They'll say that no one takes Maduro seriously, that the Petrograd is a propaganda stunt, that the US can afford to ignore it. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us here. The US ignored China's rise for decades, dismissing it as a cheap manufacturer that would never challenge American technological dominance. It ignored Russia's resurgence in the 2000s, assuming that a country with a shrinking population and a commodity-based economy couldn't possibly be a serious rival. And now, it's making the same mistake with Latin America. The reality is that the Petrograd is just the beginning. If the US doesn't respond effectively, we'll see more Russian submarines, more Chinese warships, more Iranian drones, more North Korean ballistic missile technology in the region. And each one will chip away at US influence a little more. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's how fast. So what should the US do? The answer isn't more sanctions, more threats, or more regime change fantasies. Those tactics have failed spectacularly in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. They've only pushed these countries closer to Russia and China. What the US needs is a new strategy, one that recognizes that Latin America is no longer a passive recipient of US policy, but an active player in a multipolar world. First, the US needs to compete economically. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured billions into Latin American infrastructure. The US has the resources to do the same, but it's been hamstrung by political gridlock and a lack of vision. The Biden administration's Build Back Better World initiative was a step in the right direction, but it's been underfunded and overshadowed by other priorities. If the US wants to counter China's influence, it needs to offer Latin American countries real alternatives, not just loans, but partnerships that create jobs, transfer technology, and respect sovereignty. Second, the US needs to rethink its military posture. The Southern Command's budget has been slashed for years, even as China and Russia ramp up their presence in the region. That's a mistake. The US doesn't need to station more troops in Latin America, it needs to modernize its alliances, invest in regional security cooperation, and ensure that its partners have the capabilities to defend themselves. That means more joint exercises, more intelligence sharing, and yes, more arms sales, but not the kind that come with political strings attached. Third, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. The region is diverse, with countries that have very different interests and priorities. Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are not Venezuela or Nicaragua. They're not looking to replace the US with China or Russia, they're looking for partners who respect their autonomy. The US should engage with these countries as equals, not as junior partners in a US-led order. Finally, the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. the era of unipolarity is over. The US will have to share influence with other powers, even in its own hemisphere. That doesn't mean surrender, it means adapting. It means recognizing that the world has changed, and that the strategies that worked in the 20th century won't work in the 21st. The Petrograd is a wake-up call. But it's not just about one submarine or one country. It's about the future of US power in the Western Hemisphere. And if Washington doesn't start listening, it won't be long before the next surprise, and the next, until one day, the US wakes up to find that its backyard is no longer its own. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Petrograd incident isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political time bomb for Venezuela, and by extension, for the entire region. The Maduro regime has spent years selling the narrative that Venezuela is a besieged fortress, standing alone against imperialist aggression. But the submarine deal with Russia complicates that story in ways that could unravel the government's carefully constructed legitimacy. Let me explain why this matters. Since Hugo Chavez first took power in 1999, the Venezuelan government has relied on two key pillars to maintain economic patronage and nationalist defiance. The first pillar collapsed years ago when oil prices plummeted and mismanagement turned the world's largest proven reserves into a liability. The second pillar, defiance, has been the regime's lifeline. Every time the US imposes sanctions, every time the OAS condemns Venezuela's democratic backsliding, Maduro and his inner circle frame it as proof that the revolution is under attack. It's a classic authoritarian create an external enemy to justify internal repression. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Petrograd deal doesn't fit neatly into that narrative. If Venezuela is truly under siege by the US, why would it invite a Russian nuclear submarine into its waters? That's not defiance, that's provocation. And provocation is risky when your economy is in freefall, your military is demoralized, and your people are fleeing by the millions. The average Venezuelan isn't stupid. They know Russia isn't doing this out of altruism. They know Moscow sees Venezuela as a pawn in a larger game, one where Caracas is expendable. That's a hard sell for a government that has spent decades claiming to be the vanguard of anti-imperialism. I've spoken to opposition figures in Caracas, and the mood is shifting. For the first time in years, there's a sense that the regime's contradictions are becoming impossible to ignore. The submarine deal has forced a reckoning. Either Maduro is a sovereign leader making independent decisions, which would mean admitting that Venezuela is now a client state of Russia, or he's a puppet, which would mean admitting that the revolution has failed. Neither option is palatable for a government that has staked its legitimacy on being the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. This is where things get dangerous. Authoritarian regimes don't collapse because of external pressure, they collapse when their own narratives stop working. The Petrograd incident could be the crack that widens into a fissure. We've seen this before in the Soviet Union, in apartheid South Africa, even in Pinochet's Chile. When the ruling elite can no longer justify their rule to themselves, let alone to their people, the system becomes brittle. And brittle systems break. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. There are three plausible paths forward, and none of them are pretty. The first is the most likely in the short escalation. The Maduro regime doubles down on its alliance with Russia, using the submarine deal as proof that Venezuela is now a global player, not just a regional nuisance. We'll see more military cooperation, joint exercises, arms transfers, maybe even a permanent Russian naval presence in Venezuelan waters. The regime will frame this as a victory, but it's really a sign of desperation. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1990s. The Air Force can barely keep its planes in the air, the Navy is a rusting fleet of obsolete vessels, and the Army is more concerned with smuggling and corruption than national defense. A Russian military footprint might give Maduro some breathing room, but it also makes Venezuela a target. The US has shown it's willing to take risks in its own hemisphere, just look at the 2019 coup attempt in Venezuela or the 2020 assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. If Washington decides that a Russian submarine in the Caribbean is an unacceptable threat, the rules of engagement could change quickly. The second scenario is fragmentation. The Petrograd deal has already exposed divisions within the Venezuelan elite. Diosdado Cabello, the hardline leader of the ruling PSUV party, has been vocal in his support for the deal, framing it as a necessary alliance against U.S. aggression. But others in the government, particularly those with business ties to China, are quietly uneasy. China has been Venezuela's lifeline, providing billions in loans and investment, but Beijing has no interest in a proxy war with the U.S. in the Caribbean. If the submarine deal leads to a U.S. military response, China could pull back, leaving Venezuela even more isolated. That kind of infighting is dangerous for a regime that relies on unity to survive. We saw this in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, when the Politburo split between reformers and hardliners. The result wasn't pretty. The third scenario is the most collapse. This isn't the most likely outcome, but it's the one that keeps policymakers in Washington up at night. If the regime's narrative unravels, if the military fractures, if the economy spirals further, Venezuela could descend into chaos. We're not talking about a peaceful transition of power here. We're talking about a failed state on the doorstep of the U.S., with Russian and Chinese proxies vying for influence, criminal gangs controlling territory, and millions more refugees flooding into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The last time a major Latin American country collapsed, Haiti in the 1990s, the region paid the price for decades. Venezuela is 10 times the size of Haiti, with 10 times the geopolitical significance. Here's the: none of these scenarios are inevitable. The U.S. still has options, but they require something Washington has struggled with in recent years: strategic patience. The instinct in D.C. will be to respond with more sanctions, more military posturing, more bluster. But that's exactly what the Maduro regime wants. It needs an external enemy to justify its rule. The smarter play is to let the contradictions in Caracas play out. The submarine deal has already weakened the regime's narrative. The U.S. should focus on amplifying those contradictions, supporting opposition voices, exposing corruption, and offering a credible alternative to Russian and Chinese influence. But let's be, this isn't just about Venezuela. The Petrograd incident is a microcosm of a larger struggle for influence in Latin America. The region is up for grabs, and the U.S. is losing ground. China has spent the last decade buying influence through infrastructure deals and loans. Russia has positioned itself as the anti-U.S. superpower, selling arms and political support to regimes that Washington has alienated. The U.S., meanwhile, has been distracted by the Middle East, by China's rise in Asia, by its own domestic dysfunction. The question now is whether Washington is willing to wake up. The Petrograd is a warning shot, but it's not the last one. The next surprise could come from Nicaragua, where Russia has been exiting its military footprint, or from Cuba, where China is investing in deep-water ports. Or from Brazil, where President Lula is playing a delicate game between Washington and Beijing. The U.S. can't afford to ignore these developments. The Western Hemisphere is still its backyard, but the fence is getting higher, and the neighbors are getting bolder. The real lesson of the Petrograd isn't about submarines or military strategy. It's about power: who has it, who wants it, and what they're willing to do to keep it. The Maduro regime is gambling that Russia's support will keep it in power. The U.S. is gambling that its sanctions and pressure will force a change. But the biggest gamble of all is being taken by the Venezuelan people, who are caught in the middle. They're the ones who will pay the price if this game goes wrong. And history shows that when great powers play with pawns, it's the pawns who get sacrificed first. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about submarines or even about Venezuela, it's a story about the slow-motion collapse of U.S. hegemony in its own neighborhood. And the most dangerous part? Washington still doesn't seem to grasp the scale of the problem. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. For decades, the U.S. treated Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where stability was assumed and influence was taken for granted. The Monroe Doctrine, that 19th-century relic, was supposed to guarantee American dominance in the hemisphere. But the world has changed, and the doctrine's modern interpretation, one that relies on sanctions, occasional military posturing, and the occasional coup, has become a liability. The Petrograd incident is just the latest symptom of a deeper the erosion of U.S. soft power and the rise of alternative power centers that don't play by Washington's rules. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is losing Latin America not because of some grand conspiracy, but because it has failed to offer a compelling alternative to the deals being made in Moscow and Beijing. Take the numbers. Between 2005 and 2022, China's trade with Latin America grew from $50 billion to over $450 billion. That's not just commerce, that's influence. Meanwhile, Russia's arms sales to the region have surged, with Venezuela alone accounting for $11 billion in purchases since 2005, including fighter jets, tanks, and now, apparently, submarines. The US, by contrast, has spent the last 20 years oscillating between neglect and heavy-handed intervention, neither of which has endeared it to the region's leaders or its people. But let's out even further. The Petrograd isn't just a Venezuelan problem, it's a symptom of a global shift in military and economic power. The submarine itself is a case study in how the rules of the game are changing. For most of the 20th century, submarines were the exclusive domain of great powers. The US and the Soviet Union built fleets of nuclear-powered behemoths, while smaller nations made do with aging diesel-electric boats. But in the last 2 decades, that dynamic has flipped. Advances in battery technology, air-independent propulsion, and modular construction have made submarines cheaper, quieter, and deadlier than ever. Countries like South Korea, Germany, and even Turkey are now exporting submarines to nations that Washington once considered firmly within its sphere of influence. The Petrograd, whatever its origins, is a sign that the submarine club is no longer exclusive, and that's a problem for the US Navy, which has spent decades assuming it could control the seas unchallenged. So what should the US do about it? The establishment answer is usually some combination of more sanctions, more military exercises, and more diplomatic pressure. But that's the same playbook that got us here. Sanctions on Venezuela have been in place since 2017, and they've done little except push Maduro closer to Russia and China. Military exercises in the Caribbean are useful for signaling, but they don't address the root causes of instability. And diplomatic pressure? Well, let's just say that after the debacle of the 2019 Lima Group, which collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, it's clear that Washington's approach to Latin America is in need of a serious overhaul. Here's what a real strategy might look like. First, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. The region is a patchwork of nations with distinct interests, histories, and grievances. A one-size-fits-all approach, whether it's sanctions or military aid, is doomed to fail. Instead, Washington should adopt a differentiated strategy, one that recognizes that Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia have different relationships with the US than Venezuela or Nicaragua. That means more engagement, not less. It means reviving the kind of economic diplomacy that the US once excelled at, think the Alliance for Progress, but updated for the 21st century. And it means being willing to compete with China and Russia on their own infrastructure, trade, and investment. Second, the US needs to rethink its approach to military power in the region. The Petrograd is a wake-up call. Submarines are force multipliers, and their proliferation in Latin America, whether through Russian sales, Chinese financing, or domestic production, changes the calculus for the US Navy. The days of uncontested naval dominance in the Caribbean are over. That doesn't mean the US should abandon its military presence, but it does mean that the Pentagon needs to start thinking about how to counter asymmetric threats in its own backyard. That could mean more investment in unmanned systems, better maritime domain awareness, or even a revival of the kind of coastal defense partnerships that the US once had with nations like Brazil during World War II. Third, and most importantly, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a problem to be managed and start treating it as a partner to be cultivated. That means listening to the region's leaders, even when they say things Washington doesn't want to hear. It means recognizing that the era of US dominance is over and that the future will be defined by competition, not control. And it means offering a vision for the hemisphere that goes beyond the tired dichotomy of with us or against us. The US has a chance to redefine its relationship with Latin America, but only if it's willing to shed the assumptions of the past. Let me be, none of this will be easy. The US political system is not exactly known for its long-term strategic thinking, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And Latin America, for all its importance, rarely gets the attention it deserves in Washington. But the alternative, continuing to muddle through, hoping that the next crisis will somehow resolve itself, is a recipe for disaster. The Petrograd is just the beginning. The next surprise could come from a Chinese-built port in Cuba, a Russian military base in Nicaragua, or even a homegrown submarine program in Brazil. The question is whether the US will be ready when it does. I've spent enough time in the world of geopolitics to know that change doesn't come from grand declarations or sudden epiphanies. It comes from hard choices, from recognizing that the old ways of doing things no longer work. The Petrograd is a warning, but it's also an opportunity. The US can either double down on the strategies that have failed it in Latin America, or it can try something new. The choice is Washington's. But the clock is ticking. And in geopolitics, as in life, the cost of inaction is often higher than the cost of change.